Hello and welcome to Reportage. This is Danish bin Nabi. In today's segment of Reportage, I have this wonderful book titled Indian Soldiers in World War One: Race and Representation in Britain's Imperial War, written by Andrew T. Jarboe and which is published by Speaking Tiger. It talks in detail about the Indian soldiers in First World War. To make a sense of what First World War is, let's go to Andrew and listen to this story. Andrew, before I ask you about the book, just a shadowy question which I want to understand from you. World War One was known for the trench warfare. How actually this concept came into being? Who gave it? Who gave this concept? How was this developed?
I think what you're asking is why is the image of the Western Front, of the trenches and the mud and the barbed wire, why is that what comes to mind when we think of World War One? I think that's because when it was happening, a lot of people had that experience of the war. And then two, I think because when it ended and people began writing about it. So I'm thinking, for example, of the wave of war novels that started to hit at the end of the 1920s, especially by, say, British writers. The focus was on the Western Front. And so for more than a century, that is where our gaze has remained. And if you think, say, more recently, even in popular film, like 1917, or now streaming on Netflix, All Quiet on the Western Front, great movies, visually stunning and horrifying, but that is where our gaze continues to remain. But it remains that the war was much bigger than that. It encompassed much of the Earth's land and water surfaces. There was fighting in Poland and in Lithuania. There was fighting in Macedonia, in Greece. There was fighting in Egypt. There was fighting in East Africa. There was fighting in Iraq and in Syria and in Palestine.
And trench warfare was not used in these countries.
Well, it depends. So the Western Front had trenches. The Macedonian front had trenches. The Gallipoli front had trenches. Generally, where you had huge masses of men and material in sort of geographically confined spaces, that is where stalemate and trench warfare tended to develop. You didn't see trenches like you saw on the Western Front in France and Belgium. You didn't see that in Poland. You didn't see that in Iraq. You didn't see that in Palestine or in Syria or in East Africa. So different battlefronts witnessed different styles of warfare.
I completely get your point. Now to the book. And your book starts about the racism in British Army. You write, and I quote you, that mostly they were recruited from Punjab, NWFP, and Nepal. Why were they, the Indian soldiers, recruited mainly from these three areas?
This is probably a legacy of the rebellion of 1857. And one of the lessons that the British took to heart, and a lesson informed by their own racist Orientalist lens. One of the lessons that they took was that some communities could be relied upon in a crisis and others could not. And at the end of the day, their goal is to subjugate and colonize this huge, the Indian subcontinent. And so there are going to be some populations that they can rely on and some that they can't. In the late 1800s, of course, social Darwinism becomes all the rage. Pseudo-racial science becomes all the rage. And, within their own populations, of the British Isles, the British are sort of looking for what they think of as the manliest stock, as the most martial races. And, so Scottish Highlanders, are placed at the top of that hierarchy. And then they sort of do similar work in India. They say, okay, who are the most martial races upon whom we can rely in an emergency? And they land on Punjab and they land on sort of northwest frontier.
And Nepal.
Yeah, yeah. And they land on Nepal, the Gurkhas. And that is where they land. It's convenient for them too because it becomes a strategy of divide and rule. So they can propagate this myth of the effeminate Bengali who couldn't possibly bear arms and is unmanly, as opposed to the manly Punjabi Sikh, for example. And it's a way to pit people against one another. It's self-serving, but it's a way to divide and rule.
Andrew, I would also like to understand from you that the Indian soldiers faced discrimination on the battlefront too. Whenever they lost any front, they were labeled with names and discriminated. But when the white soldiers, the Brits, lost any front, there was no hue and cry. Why?
Yeah. Bullets, I think I write in the book, bullets don't discriminate, but policy and perception do discriminate. And so, for example, Indian troops are deployed to France before the end of 1914, and Indian infantry are there in France and in Belgium through the end of 1915. The cavalry will remain in France until 1918. But 1915 on the Western Front, that is a year of stalemate. No one is getting anywhere. No British Empire troops are making meaningful advances or gains. Yeah, no one's getting anywhere. They're stuck.
Unless they don't get Indian soldiers on the front.
Right. No one's making any significant gains. But when things go badly for, say, white troops, well, you chalk it up to bad conditions on the battlefield, a stubborn enemy, etc. But when things go badly for Indian troops, they chalk it up to, oh, well, of course they're not going to do well here. One of the tropes that you hear spun over and over and over again in the British press, they'll say, oh, Indian troops in France are like loosing a tiger on an ice floe. Of course, a tiger is not going to do well in the Arctic. It's not his natural environment. And you hear this sort of racist stuff in 1915 too. That, well, of course Indians aren't going to do well in France. It's just too different. They'd be much better someplace else. And this kind of thinking actually then shapes policy towards the very end of the war. So in 1918, of course, in March, the Germans launched this all-out, desperate final offensive on the Western Front. This is their opportunity to win the war, really before the Americans arrive in force. And at first, it's wildly successful. They smash through the British Fifth Army. They gain tons of ground. I think they reach within 60 miles of Paris, and their big Krupp guns are lobbing huge explosive shells onto the French capital. And for the British, this is a panic moment. And the internal communications are, we need to get as many troops to the Western Front as we can, as fast as we can. But then when you read further, what you discover is they say, well, we need to get as many white troops as we can to France. So, okay, we've been raising all these new Indian battalions in 1917 and 1918. Let's send them to the fighting in Palestine. Let's send them to the fighting in Mesopotamia in order to free up white battalions to be sent to France. And so it's this narrative that they spin that will then later in the war actually have profound effects on policy in shaping who goes where.
Andrew, very importantly, in the book you have analyzed about the Indian newspapers from 1914 to 1919, 1920 basically. And you write in the book that all the Indian newspapers, including the moderate members of the Congress, plus Mahatma Gandhi in South Africa, we are all supportive of the British war efforts. Why? Why was it so?
Yeah, Gandhi is pro-war. The nationalists are pro-empire. Um, you know, there is discussion of Swaraj, there's discussion of home rule, there's discussion of self-government. All that stuff is there, but it hasn't taken the leap yet towards independence. It is still greater Indian autonomy and greater equality within the broader umbrella of the British Empire.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you. Let me quote you what you just said so that I don't misquote you. Gandhi was pro-war and moderates were pro-empire.
Mhm.
Please
Yes.
carry on with your answer.
Okay. So, during the war, the position of the moderates, even the position of the so-called extremists, so Tilak, for example, their position is that Indians should support the war. Indians should support the empire. Now, they sort of couch it as like, we should support the empire because if we demonstrate our loyalty, we will be rewarded on the other side. We will get self-government. And then increasingly by 1917, 1918, they're saying we will get home rule. But what they mean when they say these things is they want, sort of their own parliamentary representative government, like what Australia enjoys, like what Canada enjoys, like what the so-called white dominions enjoy. But that's really sort of the thinking, is that if we are loyal, there will be a reward on the other side. And so this moment is a test, and it's one that we should seek to pass. It's a test we should seek to pass. The turn towards independence, towards confrontation, towards non-cooperation with the empire, that doesn't really happen until after the war, and it's because of what principally happened, say, in 1919, with the brutal suppression of mass demonstrations. Amritsar comes to mind. It's because of what happens after the war that, say, folks like Gandhi, among others, begin to make a stronger turn away from the empire towards independence.
Andrew, please explain to me. You write in the book that more Indian soldiers, when deployed to Mesopotamia, died of disease than bullet. Around 17,000 of them were deployed in that area, and only 4,000 survived. Why were the British Empire not taking adequate medical care of the Indian soldiers?
The numbers you're citing, I think, might be from East Africa. But the point does remain. Indian troops fighting in Mesopotamia were more likely to die from disease than from bullets, while Indian troops deployed to France were more likely to die from high explosives and bullets than from disease. And there are a few reasons for that. The first reason for that is that an Indian soldier deployed to France is in Western Europe, where there is just more advanced infrastructure and access to things like railroads and state-of-the-art hospitals and all of these things. So, like, the infrastructure, in a sense, is kind of already there waiting to be utilized. And the British do kind of take extra steps in 1914 and 1915 to set up new hospitals for Indian troops. So there's that. But beyond that, there's sort of the history of medical care in the Indian Army. The Indian Army's medical care system was separate and unequal. British troops serving in the Indian Army received one kind of healthcare, and Indian soldiers received another. British troops were serving in the Indian Army would be brought to the hospital. But to save money, the thinking was with Indian troops, well, we'll bring the hospital to them. And the result is that Indian hospitals, the hospitals that serve Indian troops before the war, are just inferior. You are as likely to get sick in hospital if you're Indian as you are to get well, whereas British troops are going to get just better healthcare. This sort of separate and unequal healthcare system, we might also call it underinvestment in sepoy healthcare. This followed the troops to Mesopotamia with disastrous results, because that is a ugly war, it's a mean war, and it's a war in a region that does not have the kind of infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure that, say, France and Britain do. And so if you get sick, if your leg gets shattered by an explosive in Mesopotamia, you're in a lot of trouble. You are not going to get the kind of attention that you need, that you would get if you're in France. That healthcare system did not follow Indian troops to France, where British home authorities took over. Those troops who served in France were integrated into the British Expeditionary Force. And so the home government in London, they're in charge of them, as opposed to the troops in Mesopotamia, where through the first half of the war, the government of India, the British-run government of India, is in charge of them. And what the British home government understood was that a lot of eyes were watching this so-called experiment of deploying South Asian soldiers to white Western Europe. And they understood that they had a propaganda opportunity on their hands if we treat them really well, and if we are seen treating them really well. That's going to pay dividends for our colonial rule in India, right? That's going to lengthen the life of the empire, if you will. But they also, I think, sensed at the same time, if we screw this up, if they're seen receiving poor treatment and poor healthcare, that could really cost us. And, 1857 is always in the background for British policy makers and thinkers. They always know about that. And so anything they can do to kind of tamp down on the possibility of things getting out of hand, they'll generally take it. But the war in Mesopotamia, as a consequence, one observer at the time described it as no man's child. It was out of sight. It was out of mind. And so you continue treating people to an unequal healthcare system because maybe you can just sort of keep getting away with it. And they did get away with it until they didn't. It all exploded.
Andrew, I would like to understand about General Nixon. He was sent to Mesopotamia for the campaign, but I don't know why he was in a rush to capture Baghdad. Please enlighten me on this General Nixon thing.
In a rush. So Nixon sends his subordinate, General Townshend of the 6th Division, up the Tigris and Euphrates River to go after Baghdad in late 1915. And he does that at a time when they don't have the manpower for it. They don't have the backup for it. They don't have all the sort of stuff you would need to pull off such an operation. But they do it. They probably do it because it's 1915 and the war is not going well anywhere. The Western Front is stalemated. The Germans seem to be advancing into Poland on the Eastern Front. The Gallipoli campaign is going nowhere. And it's clear from the communications going on within the very highest places of the British government. They're looking for a win. And they're very sensitive to how their poor performance on the battlefield might appear in neutral countries, but also how it might appear in, say, India. Because they know that the Germans and the Ottomans are making a play for Indian loyalty. The Germans have this whole propaganda campaign to sort of induce Indians to switch sides. The Ottomans are involved in it too. They're not as enthusiastic about it as the Germans are. But the Germans and the Ottomans are making a play for India. The war is not going well. Losing a war, bungling a war looks bad. And I think the British sensed they needed a win. And the capture of Kut in 1915 looked like it might have just opened the road to Baghdad. And if you can take Baghdad, that's a propaganda win. So, against really better judgment, go for it. And they go for it. And it ends disastrously.
Andrew, please lecture me and make me understand about the Ottomans. What was the need for the Ottomans to join this war? And were the Ottomans really prepared for this war?
Oh God, no. So I'm not an expert on the Ottomans and their war. So I should say that up front. But no, they are not ready for this war.
So what was the need for them to jump into such a thing when they were not prepared?
Why are they doing it? So the question is, why did the Ottomans join the war when they joined in November 1914? The Germans had been making overtures and promising stuff. The Ottoman government is probably looking at its own sort of internal divisions and seeing war as an opportunity to shore up its own flanks and strengthen the regime. If it goes well, if the war goes well, if it ends quickly enough, that should work.
In the book, you also mentioned that there were only 5,000 physicians and surgeons for the Ottoman Empire to look after at least 3 million soldiers, Ottoman soldiers in the war.
Oh, in the Ottoman army?
Yeah.
They don't have the doctors that a mass army would require. They don't have the hospitals, the medical personnel, the staff. They don't have the railroads to transport wounded men from battlefields to places of care. If they're going to carry on a big, ambitious war of their own, they don't have the stuff either. And as soon as they enter the war, their war goes badly too. I mean, the Ottomans needed that win on the Dardanelles at Gallipoli as much as the British felt they needed a win at Baghdad in 1915. Ottoman Turkey's war goes terribly in 1915. They send an army up into the Caucasus, and it practically freezes to death. And the next thing you know, it's this debacle, it's this disaster, and that army's in full retreat. They're fighting in lower Mesopotamia, in what is now Kuwait. They're chased out of there in very short order before the end of 1914. And, Britain and India's war in Mesopotamia appears to be going well enough through early 1915. So, yeah, their war doesn't go well either.
Andrew, they also did not have the railway system, if I am correct, which you have mentioned in the book. What about their railway system, the Ottoman railway system?
Correct. I don't know that I can actually say more beyond that. They don't have the kind of infrastructure that one would want to have in order to carry out ambitious military campaigns in the Middle East. They sent an army marching from Turkey, Syria, down to the Suez Canal in January, February of 1915. And it really surprised everybody that army reached the Suez Canal as quickly as it did. I've been doing some more work with Indian newspapers since writing the book, and the Turkish army's assault on the Suez Canal in early 1915 really sent shockwaves through India and sort of raises this alarm of, are they really that mobile? Like, do we need to, these are Indian newspapers writing, saying, do we need to be worried about our own Western frontier? It might not be safe. If the Turks could send an army to Suez, they could send an army here conceivably, like, hurry, hurry. If you haven't sent your son off to the war, now is the time to do it because India is in danger. But yeah, they just don't have the infrastructure they would need to carry on the kind of war they imagined fighting or they chose to fight.
Andrew, I'm terribly running out of time, and this is my last question to you. I would like to know and understand from you. It's a hypothetical question, basically. Why did Ottomans join the Germans in the First World War and not the British? How would things have played? Would things have played actually differently had the Ottomans joined the British?
Short answer is very differently. And here is one explanation as to how. When the Ottomans joined the Central Powers in October, November 1914, they closed the Straits of Bosporus. The Straits of Bosporus are how Russia is how Russian grain steams out of the Black Sea through the Mediterranean and eventually reaches consumers in England. A Londoner in 1914, much of her or his diet is imported. Russian wheat was the stuff that bakers in London used to bake their bread. Okay. So one of the immediate consequences of the Ottomans joining the war is that the British have to go finding a new source of food, a new source of grain. And they'll find two sources. One is India, and the other is the United States of America. And both of those countries will be asked to produce more and more and more food for Britain's war effort. And they will, with some, I'll call them disastrous outcomes. By 1918, there are severe food shortages in India. There are undeclared famines in pockets of the country. Because of the war, because of industrialization in the big cities, there is a labor shortage in the countryside. And Indian food yields have dropped every year of the war. Indians are producing less and less food, but are being asked to export more and more to feed the war. Whereas a lot of that grain is going to England, a lot of it is going to the Middle East too, to feed Indian troops fighting the war against the Ottomans. So that ties it back to your question directly. But as a result, you have a very large segments of the Indian population are hungry and malnourished and maybe borderline starving by 1918. And then the flu hits. And when the flu pandemic hits in 1918 and 1919, and that hits in kind of three waves, kind of like COVID did, India sees some of the worst outcomes. It's estimated by demographers that maybe 50 million people died in the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. I think something like 13.5 million of the 50 million worldwide who died in India. That's a result of the war. That's because of the war, and that's because of food shortages caused by the war. And those food shortages caused by the war are stemming from the fact that the Ottomans joined the Central Powers and cut off Russian grain from reaching markets as it used to.
So it was a disaster for the Ottomans, not only for the Ottomans, but for the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a fair conclusion.
Andrew, pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. Let me hold your book once again so that people read it, get it, buy it, read it, and understand about the World War One and about the Indian soldiers. Pleasure, always pleasure talking to you.
Delight. Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you.
Please subscribe to our channel Reportage and press the bell icon to remain updated.